I was once a fighter pilot soaring through the skies in an F-15E Strike Eagle, once the pride of an entire nation. I was once the cherished son of a powerful family. But now I sit here in a dimly lit room, illuminated only by the faint glow of an old desk lamp, staring at the fragments of my life and wondering when everything started to fall apart. This house isn't large, just enough for me and Ivy, my daughter, to get by. For wooden walls, a worn-out sofa, and a fireplace I rarely light, because every time I look into the flames, I see burning memories. I'm not the kind of person who dwells on the past. Pilots like me were trained to always look forward, to anticipate the flight path, calculate angles, and keep our minds sharp even when the G-forces threaten to make us black out. But tonight, with Ivy sound asleep in her room, with the world outside plunged into silence, I can't stop myself from looking back. Back to where it all began, and where it all ended. I'm not sure I want to tell this story. Some things are so painful that you just want to bury them. Like how they bury a wrecked plane deep in the ground so no one can see its blemish. But there's something inside me, a small remnant of the man who once believed in honor and truth, urging me to speak. Perhaps it's for Ivy, so that one day she'll understand why her father chose silence, chose to walk away from it all, chose a simple life over continuing to soar to the heights others dream of. Or perhaps I just want to understand why myself. I was born in Washington, D.C., in a mansion so vast that every step I took as a child echoed as if I were walking through a museum. My father, Senator Raymond Wallace, was a man the world knew through his televised speeches, handshakes with heads of state, and perfectly rehearsed smiles practiced in front of a mirror. He was a conservative, tough. Everything about him was sculpted and measured, right down to how long he held your gaze in a handshake. To him, the Wallace family wasn't just a name. It was a brand, a symbol of power and honor. And I, the eldest son, was expected to keep that brand polished. My childhood wasn't filled with running through fields or climbing trees with friends. Instead, I grew up amidst lavish dinner parties where I had to wear a suit from the age of 6. I remember one night, tugging at the stiff collar of my miniature tuxedo, whispering, "Mom, can I change now?" She knelt beside me in the hallway, smoothing out the fabric. "Just one more hour, sweetheart. Then you can run upstairs and read your book." I sighed, nodding, because I knew she was trying. My mother, gentle, always living in my father's shadow, tried to make up for it with small kindnesses. A warm look when I stumbled on my introduction. A soft hand on my back as we passed through rooms filled with politicians and donors. When the guests finally left and the house fell quiet again, she would tiptoe into my room even if it was late. She'd pull the blankets up to my chin, her voice a hush in the dark. "Want a story tonight?" I never said no. She'd sit at the edge of my bed and read aloud, her voice wrapping around me like the blanket I clutched. Her stories were always the same, ones about far-off lands and brave boys who found their own way. I didn't know then how much I needed them. Just her hugs and bedtime stories. But even she couldn't protect me from my father's harsh rules. "Griffin," he would say, his voice low and sharp as a blade, the kind of tone that didn't allow for questions or emotion. "You're a Wallace. You're not allowed to fail. You're not allowed to be weak." Those words were repeated so often, I could almost hear them echoing in my head long after he had left the room. It wasn't discipline, it was doctrine. The Wallace name had to be flawless, even if it meant breaking the boy behind it. I had a younger brother, Corbin, 3 years my junior. Corbin was the golden child in our parents' eyes, especially my father's. While I was pressured to excel in academics, in sports, in keeping my back straight and my hair perfectly combed, Corbin was allowed to be free. He studied art. He painted without worrying about getting his clothes dirty. He played the piano, losing himself in melodies, not expectations. I didn't resent Corbin. He was a good kid, always smiling, always handing me scribbled drawings he'd made, saying, "This one's you, flying, or that's the mountain we'll live on when we're grown up." He meant it. There was a kind of purity in Corbin I couldn't touch. But deep down, I was jealous. Jealous because he didn't have to carry the weight of the Wallace name on his shoulders. He didn't have to answer for it, or polish it, or bleed for it. He just got to be. The only person who truly understood me back then was my grandfather, my mom's father. A retired World War II pilot with hands worn like old leather and eyes that still held the horizon. He wasn't like my father. He didn't care about politics, about status, or photo shoots in the garden for campaign brochures. He'd sit me on the old porch swing out back and tell me stories about flying his P-51 Mustang, about skimming through clouds and laughing at the wind. "Grandson," he used to say, his voice cracking like a radio transmission but full of fire. "Up there, no one cares whose son you are. It's just you, the plane, and your decisions." His eyes would light up like a kid's on Christmas. "The sky doesn't take bribes, doesn't bow to names. It makes you earn every second. Those words, they carved themselves into me, like some quiet fire I didn't yet understand. I knew then I wanted to fly. Not for pride, not for power. For freedom. For me. I never told anyone about the nights I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, pretending it was a cockpit canopy. In those dreams, I wasn't Griffin Wallace, son of Senator Wallace. I was just Griffin, a boy with wings of steel, gliding above everything, untouchable. But that dream, like everything good in my life, was never easy. When I turned 17, I applied to the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. My father didn't approve. A pilot, he scoffed one night over dinner, cutting into his steak like it had insulted him. You could be a lawyer, a politician, even a governor one day. Why choose a dangerous job with no future? Risk your life flying when you could shape the country. I didn't answer him. There was no point. He wasn't asking, he was telling. But I had already made up my mind. I quietly gathered my application materials, filled everything out myself, double-checked it all twice. I didn't want to rely on his name. I didn't want anyone at USAFA to think I got in because of influence or legacy. I wanted it to be mine. I mailed it without telling him. Weeks later, when the acceptance letter finally arrived, I locked myself in the downstairs bathroom and cried. Not out of joy. No, joy would come later, if ever. I cried because, for the first time in my life, I had done something completely on my own. It was a fragile, personal victory, and it meant everything to me. That evening, I walked into the living room where he was reading the paper and held out the letter. He took it, skimmed the top, nodded once. Good, he said, folding it neatly. But don't embarrass me. That was it. No hug, no handshake, no pride, just another order. I stood there in the vast living room of our family home, marble floors cold beneath my feet, clutching the envelope that had just changed my life. I'd touched the sky, just barely, and already he was yanking me back down. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter in half, to shout at him that this wasn't his victory. It was mine. But I didn't. I just nodded like an obedient soldier and turned away. Inside me, the flame of my dreams still burned. And I knew that no matter what my father said, I would fly. Not for him, but for myself. The United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs was where I stepped into a new world. One that was harsh, unyielding, and unforgiving. From the very first day, as I set foot on the campus with its cold gray stone buildings standing firm under the vast Colorado sky and the Rocky Mountains looming like sentinels in the distance, I felt the pressure tighten around me like a vice. This wasn't an ordinary school. It was a crucible, a place where young men like me were thrown into the fire, not to be molded, but to see if we could survive the burn, to see who cracked, who bent, and who came out forged into something stronger. Every day began at 0500. No excuses, no delays. The wake-up call pierced the air like a war cry. Let's go, Wallace, someone would shout down the hallway, fists banging on doors. Time to earn those wings. We ran 10 miles in the biting cold, our breath fogging in front of us, our lungs screaming from the thin air of the high plains. Our legs burned, our boots cut into our feet. The cold didn't care. Neither did the academy. Then came the real battle, classes, aerodynamics, mathematics, air combat tactics, military history. I memorized everything. Every equation, every formation, every date. But the hardest part wasn't the material. Wasn't the running, the push-ups, or the drills. It was the stares, the whispers. The senator's son, they called me behind my back. Like I didn't hear them. Must be nice, one cadet muttered once when I passed by in the mess hall. Bet his old man made a call. They thought I got in because of the Wallace name. Because of my father's shadow. They didn't know about the nights I stayed up until 2 a.m., fighting to keep my eyes open over textbooks. They didn't know how many times I ran until I threw up just to beat my last time. How often I stared at my trembling hands and told myself, keep going. I didn't blame them. In a place like USAFA, where everyone wanted to be the best, suspicion was part of the air we breathed. It kept us hungry. But every time I heard that nickname, the senator's son, I clenched my fists and reminded myself, you'll show them. I studied like every exam was a battlefield. I trained like every mile was a test of worth. There were days when my body begged me to stop. When every step back to my dorm felt like I was dragging lead. When the idea of collapsing on that stiff mattress was all I could think about. But then I'd remember my grandfather, his stories, his smile, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the sky. And I'd rise. Again, I wasn't just running from my father's shadow. I was chasing something real. Life at the academy was relentless, grueling, cold in every sense of the word. There were mornings we stood in the rain, soaked to the skin in our uniforms, while instructors screamed over thunder and wind about the angle of our hats or a dull spot on a shoe. Cadet Wallace, One barked at me once, his face inches from mine. You think your daddy can polish these boots for you? Shine them again. I want to see my soul in those toes. Yes, sir. I snapped, voice hoarse. And there were nights, so many nights, when I sat at my desk, bones aching, eyes burning from lack of sleep, trying to wrestle through a dynamics problem I barely understood, because one slip meant a lower grade. A lower grade meant you slipped off the flight list, and slipping off the flight list meant the dream died. But there were also moments that made it all worthwhile. Like the first time I sat in a flight simulator, gripping the control stick as the screen in front of me displayed a vast blue sky. Even though it was just a simulation, with a motion platform beneath me and surround screens trying to mimic the cockpit of an F-15, my heart raced like I was actually airborne. The stick in my hand felt alive, like it was part of me. I could almost feel the pressure of the wind, the resistance of the climb, the freedom. That moment, that single simulated takeoff, reminded me why I was there. Among my classmates, I grew closest to Jake. Tall guy from Texas with an easy smile and that distinctive southern drawl that made everything he said sound just a little more laid back. He had this way of making everyone feel like they'd known him their whole lives. And Jake, he didn't care whose son I was. To him, I was just Griffin, the roommate who kept the room too clean, who snored a little when I was too exhausted to care, and who made him laugh with stories about my grandfather. You know, Wallace, Jake said one night as we sat in the mess hall with cold trays of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I bet your grandpa would be proud if he could see you now. He said it so casually, like it wasn't going to hit me in the chest the way it did. Simple words, but they were like a shot of strength straight to the heart. Jake didn't know it, but on the days when everything felt like too much, when my body screamed and my brain wanted to shut down, he was one of the reasons I kept going. He reminded me that I wasn't alone. Then came Rosalie. She came into my life like a gentle breeze amid the storm of pressure and discipline, like calm air suddenly parting heavy clouds. Rosalie was a psychology instructor, teaching a course on stress management for cadets. Not the kind of class most of us took seriously at first. But she wasn't like the other instructors. The first time I saw her, she stood at the front of the classroom in a light blue blouse, her wavy brown hair pulled back in a neat twist. Her voice was warm but clear, confident, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to command silence. She didn't lecture. She spoke. She connected. She didn't just rattle off theories or definitions. She told us stories, real stories, about pilots who had faced the edge, who had been broken by fear or trauma and clawed their way back. In the sky, she said once, pacing slowly in front of the chalkboard, you can control the plane. But if you can't control yourself, you'll never take off. Her green eyes scanned the room, locking briefly with mine. And in that second, I felt something shift. Like she saw through the uniform, through the name. Like she saw me. I don't know when I started falling for her. Maybe it was the day she asked me to stay after class to talk about the personal essay I'd written, about my grandfather, and about the dream I had of flying ever since I was a boy lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Your story is moving, Griffin, she said, her voice softer than usual. She tilted her head slightly, eyes thoughtful. It's not just about flying, is it? I felt my face flush, not from embarrassment, but because she looked at me like she genuinely wanted to understand. Not study me, not evaluate me, understand. We started talking more after that. At first, just about coursework, assignments, questions about managing stress. But over time, the conversations changed. We talked about life, about dreams. Rosalie was 2 years older than me, but she never made me feel small. If anything, she made me feel bigger, like I could stretch out and take up the space I'd spent years shrinking from. Like I could do more than just meet expectations, I could exceed them. Our first dates, if you could call them that, were in the mess hall, laughing over terrible powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like metal. Later, we'd walk together along the trails around campus, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking for hours. She loved walking, and I loved walking with her. She told me stories about her family back in Ohio, about how her dad worked 2 jobs and her mom was a nurse, about her dream, not just to teach, but to become a psychologist who could help soldiers find their way back after war. You know, she said once, as we sat on a rock overlooking a valley. I think you pilots are stronger than people realize, she said once as we sat watching the sunset from that same rock overlooking the valley. But sometimes I worry that you forget how to talk about what you feel. I laughed, partly to deflect, partly out of habit. Pilots don't have time for emotions, I said, smirking. We're too busy defying gravity. But deep down, I knew she was right. Rosalie had this way of seeing through the cracks I didn't know I had. I didn't open up easily, not to anyone. But with her, I started letting pieces of myself show, just little by little. A story about my childhood here. A confession about the pressure I carried there. She never pushed. She just listened. And maybe that's why, by the time I graduated from the academy 4 years later, she was the first person I wanted to see. I graduated at the top of my class. The ceremony was surreal, the speeches, the applause, the perfectly orchestrated flyover. I stood in my dress blues, looking out over the crowd, scanning faces even though I already knew he wouldn't be there. Still, I called home that night. I stood alone in my dorm room, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding like I was about to face a mission. "Dad," I said when he picked up. "I graduated. Top of my class." There was a pause. "Good," he said. "What's next?" That was it. No congratulations. No pride. Just another cold expectation waiting to be fulfilled. I didn't respond. What could I say? I was used to him never being satisfied. Always moving the goalposts. Always making me feel like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. So I let it go. Instead, I turned my focus to the next step. The real dream. Fighter pilot training. The program was in Texas, and nothing could have prepared me for how brutal it would be. We started with the T-38 Talon trainers, small jets that looked almost delicate on the ground, but once in the air, moved like lightning. The first time I took off, something inside me shifted. As the ground fell away, and the blue opened up before me, vast and infinite, I felt weightless, not just physically, but emotionally. For once, I wasn't the senator's son. I wasn't the name. I was just me. But that freedom came at a steep cost. Every flight was a test, not just of skill, but of control, speed, altitude, angle, coordination. Every second, every adjustment had consequences. A single miscalculation, and you didn't get a second chance. But the hardest part? Survival training. They dropped us into the wilderness with nothing but a knife, a compass, and the will to endure. No food, no water, just your training and your grit. I learned how to build a fire from frozen wood. I learned how to hunt small game with a snare I crafted from shoelaces. I learned how to wait out the cold, teeth chattering, curled up under a tree as frost crept into my bones. There were nights I lay there, too weak to move, too hungry to think, wondering if I had anything left to give. But then I'd think of my grandfather. Of the time he told me how he survived after being shot down over enemy territory in Europe. "Grandson," he'd said, leaning forward, his hands clasped like a prayer, "the sky is never easy to conquer. But it'll teach you to be stronger than you ever thought possible." And I held on to those words. And I became stronger. Through all of it, Rosalie was my light. She moved to Texas not long after I started training, taking a position at a psychological research center near the base. We found a tiny apartment with thin walls and squeaky floors, and started living together. After a day of pushing my body and mind to the edge, I'd come home and collapse on the couch next to her. Somehow, just her presence made everything else fade. We'd eat pizza straight from the box, wrapped in a blanket, watching old movies and pretending like the world wasn't pressing in. "You'll fly an F-15 someday," she said one night, her head on my shoulder. "I'm sure of it." I laughed, kissing the top of her head. "As long as you're here, I can fly anywhere." Then, near the end of my training, she told me she was pregnant. I remember her standing in the kitchen, holding the test, her hands shaking slightly. "A baby," I mumbled, sinking into the nearest chair. My mind was spinning. We're having a baby." She laughed, eyes shimmering with tears. "Our baby, Griffin." I stood up and pulled her into my arms, holding her like I was afraid she might vanish. In that moment, the world felt full. Heavy but full, like I was holding something fragile and infinite all at once. But alongside the joy came fear. A father? Me? The same me who grew up under the shadow of a cold and distant father? The question echoed in my mind, louder than the roar of any engine I'd flown behind. Could I do better? I stared at Rosalie, at the soft curve of her belly, the life forming beneath her skin, and all the fears I'd tried to suppress surged to the surface. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered one night, as we sat on the couch, pizza box forgotten on the table, the TV flickering quietly in the background. I didn't exactly have a great example to follow. Rosalie took my hand, threading her fingers through mine. "You'll be an amazing father, Griffin," she said, her voice barely above a breath. I know it. And somehow, I believed her. After training, when I was selected to fly the F-15 E-Strike Eagle, it felt like the world had cracked open to let me through. One of the most powerful fighter jets on the planet, sleek, fast, deadly. The machine I had dreamed about since I was a boy, lying in bed with my grandfather's stories ringing in my ears. The day I received my first assignment, an operational post at a base in Arizona, I stood at the airfield with the desert sun beating down on my dress uniform, feeling like I'd touched the sky in more ways than one. But as I looked at Rosalie in the crowd, her belly now clearly showing, I knew this dream, it wasn't just mine anymore. I had to fly not only for myself, but for her, for the child about to be born, for the promises I'd made to myself on nights when I nearly gave up. My father didn't attend the assignment ceremony. He sent a brief telegram. Congratulations. Good luck. That was it. No signature. No warmth. My mother called the night before. I could hear the emotion in her voice as she tried to steady herself. I'm proud of you, Griffin, she said. We both are. We both. She still said we. But I knew why she wasn't coming. My father wouldn't allow it. Public appearances. Optics. He probably didn't want his son being celebrated for a military post instead of a seat in Congress. Corbin was the only one who came. He showed up late, holding a bouquet of slightly wilted flowers and wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big. He gave me an awkward hug that smelled faintly of paint and cigarette smoke. You did it, Griffin, he said, his voice tight with something he was trying to hide. I smiled, patting his shoulder. Thanks for being here, man. But in his eyes, I caught something, just for a second. A flicker of envy, like a small crack running through glass. I didn't want to believe it was there. I couldn't believe it. He was my brother, the only family member who'd ever really looked at me without judgment. Becoming a fighter pilot wasn't just about the aircraft or the missions. It was a war within myself, a battle against the expectations that had caged me my whole life, against the fear I never admitted, not to anyone, that every time I climbed into that cockpit might be the last. But I flew anyway, because up there, I wasn't the senator's son. I was Griffin Wallace, a pilot, a man, and soon a father. Still, I could feel it, deep down, the cracks, not just in my family, but in me. Hairline fractures that hadn't broken through yet, but I knew were there. Pressed down, waiting for pressure, for time. I didn't know then that everything I'd built would one day come crashing down like a plane shot out of the sky. Rosalie gave birth to Ivy on a warm spring afternoon in Arizona. Golden sunlight spilled through the hospital window like something out of a painting, casting soft halos across the sterile white walls. It felt like the whole world was welcoming our daughter. I stood by Rosalie's side, gripping her hand through every contraction. Her face was pale with effort, her eyes clenched shut, but she never let go of my hand. And then, her cry. Ivy's first cry. The sound hit me like a missile, piercing and raw and perfect. My heart stopped and soared at the same time. She was so small, so impossibly small. A tuft of black hair, skin like porcelain, and eyes already wide open, already searching. Her mother's eyes, green, fierce, beautiful. Ivy, Rosalie whispered, tears running down her cheeks. Exhausted, radiant, trembling with joy. We'll call her Ivy. I nodded, speechless. My throat clenched too tightly to speak. I held her in my arms, and it felt like the whole world had collapsed into something tiny and perfect and real. For the first time in my life, I felt what a family was. Not the cold, rule-bound structure I grew up in, but something real, something warm, something mine. We got married shortly after. A simple ceremony. Backyard of our rented Arizona home. Nothing fancy. No guests in tuxedos. Just a few friends, a makeshift altar, and Rosalie barefoot in the grass. She wore a plain white dress. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Her smile was brighter than the sun. I stood before her in my Air Force uniform, the ribbons straight on my chest, the hat tucked neatly under my arm, and yet I felt completely exposed, stripped down to the rawest version of myself. Rosalie stood beneath the little arch we'd decorated ourselves with white flowers from the base florist. Ivy nestled in her arms, cooing softly in the spring breeze. My heart swelled just looking at them, my girls. My family. My mother came to the ceremony. The moment she saw Ivy, tears welled up in her eyes, and she rushed forward, hugging me so tightly I could feel her ribs tremble. Then she reached for Rosalie and Ivy, brushing a hand over the baby's head like she was touching something sacred. She's beautiful, my mother whispered. She has your eyes. My father, of course, didn't come. A meeting in D.C., his assistant said. What had come was a card. Off-white. Heavy paper. His handwriting as rigid as the man himself. Congratulations. Uphold the honor. R. Wallace. I stared at the card, felt the chill behind those 4 words, and tossed it in the trash before Rosalie could even see it. Corbin came, though. He showed up with a canvas in his hands, one of his own. A painting of Rosalie and me, standing under a deep indigo sky, stars splattered across it like glittering dust. His strokes weren't perfect, but the emotion behind it was. Grandma, he said softly, looking up toward the sky, I hope you're happy. I hugged him hard. He smelled like oil paint and aftershave. My voice caught in my throat, so I just patted his back. But even then, I couldn't help noticing it again, just for a second, the flicker in his eyes. That same glint of envy I'd seen a year earlier. I chose not to dwell on it. This was my day. Our day. The early years of our marriage were the best of my life. We lived in a modest house on the edge of the base, nothing grand, just enough space for 3 hearts to beat under the same roof. Mornings were slow and warm, filled with soft touches, sleepy giggles, and Ivy's laughter echoing down the hallway. She had this way of squealing when she saw me come out of the bedroom in uniform. "Daddy," she'd shout, running into my arms. Evenings were for the porch. Rosalie and I would sit side by side, Ivy nestled between us, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The sky would bleed orange and purple, and for a little while, everything felt still. Safe. I continued to fly. The F-15E Strike Eagle was my second home. Bombing missions, escorts, international exercises. Each flight demanded perfection. The G-forces pushed against every inch of my body. The roar of engines never left my ears. Every movement had to be exact, every decision instantaneous. Lives depended on it. My own, my wingman's, innocence on the ground. But no matter how intense the mission, the thought of coming home, to Rosalie, to Ivy, always pulled me through. Rosalie still worked at the Psychological Research Center. She loved what she did. And even with her schedule packed, she always made time for us. "You're the pilot," she'd joke, folding laundry or stirring a pot on the stove, "but I'm the one keeping this family airborne." "Roger that," I'd say, wrapping my arms around her from behind. She'd laugh and lean into me. "Don't forget it, Captain." But a pilot's life was never simple. Deployments were constant. Sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes longer. I got orders for overseas assignments, Japan, Germany, the Middle East, supporting operations or training with allied forces. Each time I packed my bag, I felt a heaviness I couldn't quite describe. I'd kneel in front of Ivy, brushing her soft black curls back from her face. "I'll be back soon, okay?" I'd whisper. She'd nod, her small arms circling my neck. "Bring me a story," she'd say. "I always do." I'd smile, blinking fast. Rosalie would kiss me, her hands firm on my cheeks. "Fly safe, Griffin. We'll be waiting." And I'd nod, trying to ignore the ache in her eyes. Because even when she smiled, I could see it, that quiet sorrow, that loneliness she tried to hide behind strength. During those deployments, I lived in sparse dorm rooms with gray concrete walls and windows that never opened. The beds were hard, the air always stale, and the only sound at night was the ticking of a clock, each second reminding me that time was slipping by without them. I called Rosalie whenever I could. But the signal at those remote bases, dusty corners of the world with old satellites and bad weather, was always unreliable. And her voice over the phone always felt slightly distant. "Ivy just took her first steps, you know," Rosalie said during one of our calls from a base in Qatar. Her voice crackled slightly through the poor signal. I forced a laugh, even as something inside me twisted. "She did? On her own?" "Well, she took 3 and then collapsed into the couch giggling," she said, a smile in her voice. "You would have loved it." I closed my eyes, hand clenching the receiver tighter. "Damn, I wish I could have seen that." "I know." Her voice softened, and then she added, "I filmed it for you." But that ache stayed with me, a hollow weight that no grainy video could fill. I started sending gifts home. A delicate Japanese doll I picked up from a vendor near a joint base. A silver bracelet from Germany engraved with Ivy's initials. Trinkets, souvenirs, peace offerings. But no matter how beautiful or rare they were, I knew deep down, they were just stand-ins. Pale replacements for the memories I was missing. By the time Ivy turned 3, my mother began flying out to Arizona regularly. I think part of her was trying to make up for years of absence, and perhaps for being the silent partner in a cold marriage. She'd stay for weeks, help Rosalie with meals, take Ivy to the park, keep her company during my endless deployments. "She's just like you when you were little, Griffin," my mother said during one of our evening phone calls, her voice soft with nostalgia. "Stubborn, bright, strong, but she needs her father." Those words sliced right through me. She needs her father. I stared at the ceiling that night, in a bare metal bunk at a foreign base, wondering if I'd made the right trade. Every time I climbed into the cockpit, I told myself I was flying for my family. But every time I landed, it felt like I'd drifted a little further from them. When Ivy was 5, I began noticing changes. Rosalie still loved me, I never doubted that. But there was something quieter about her, less present. Some days, she'd listen to my stories about flying with a faint smile, but her eyes would drift, staring out the window like she wasn't really with me. She started wearing red lipstick again. "You look beautiful," I said one evening, noticing the new blouse, the extra time she'd taken with her hair. She smiled, brushing a hand through her curls. "I just want to feel like myself again." I nodded, kissed her cheek. "You are yourself." But even as I said it, I felt the sting of doubt, the kind of unease that settled low in the gut and refused to go away. And then there were the words I never expected from her. "Do your job." "I'm fine." Not come home soon. Not I miss you. Just I'm fine. I wanted to believe her. Needed to believe her. That she was strong. That she could handle the loneliness. That everything was okay. But something in her voice, something just beneath the surface, kept me up at night more than any mission ever did. Ivy, meanwhile, became the anchor of my world. My little co-pilot. She asked the most incredible questions. How high do you fly, Daddy? Do you see angels? I'd laugh, scoop her up into my arms. Sometimes, I'd say. Sometimes I fly so high I can almost hear them singing. I taught her to fold paper airplanes on the weekends I was home. We'd sit on the grass in the backyard, launching them into the wind like tiny dreams on wings. She'd chase after them, squealing with joy, and I'd just watch her, memorizing every second. Those moments were everything. The balm to the weariness. The reason I kept flying, despite the risk, the weight, the silence. As for the Wallaces in deep sea, they remained a distant echo in my life. Always looming, never gone. My father began to acknowledge my achievements after I was promoted and received a medal for a classified mission in the Middle East. He actually called. "Well done, Griffin," he said, voice clipped and formal. "You're bringing honor to the Wallace name." I stared at the phone. I don't fly for the name. I wanted to say, I don't fly for you. But I didn't bother. I knew he'd never understand. Corbin, my younger brother, had changed too. He still called once in a while, usually after a show or a gallery opening. But the warmth that once filled our talks, it had dulled. His calls became less frequent. When I visited DC, I noticed something had shifted in Corbin. He wasn't the same younger brother who used to bring me awkward hugs and starry sky paintings. He was quieter, more guarded. He spoke of his art exhibitions in New York and Chicago with a detached pride, like he'd built something of his own but wasn't sure it was enough. "You're doing well," I said one evening as we sat in a quiet corner of a Georgetown cafe, sipping coffee in the autumn chill. Corbin shrugged, stirring his cup without looking at me. "I guess." I chuckled. New York and Chicago aren't exactly, I guess, territory. He finally looked up, and I caught something in his eyes. That old flicker. "You're always the hero, huh?" he said, smiling faintly. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. I laughed, trying to keep it light. "It's not like that." But we both knew it kind of was. Not by my choice, but by the stories others told about me. The medals, the uniform, the flights. I didn't press him. Maybe I should have. But some silences in a family are just too old and too deep. When Ivy turned 8, I started to feel it, really feel it, that something fragile was forming beneath the surface of our little family. Rosalie still told me she loved me, still welcomed me with a hug whenever I came home. But the hugs felt thinner, her touch lighter, her smile slower to rise. She started going out more, joining book clubs, meeting friends I'd never heard of. "I need a life of my own, Griffin," she said one evening while pulling on a pair of heels I hadn't seen in years. I nodded, even as my stomach clenched. "I understand. You've given up a lot." She smiled at me, grateful, maybe, but her eyes had a distant glaze I couldn't name. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just afraid of the changes time brings to everyone. But whenever I saw her standing in front of the mirror, applying that red lipstick slowly, like it meant something, or spraying that perfume she used to save for anniversaries, a quiet voice inside me whispered, "You're losing her." Ivy remained my anchor, my light. She was a curious, radiant little soul who asked questions faster than I could answer them. "Do you think Grandpa could fly into space?" she once asked. "Only if they strapped rockets to that old Mustang of his," I said, and she burst into giggles. I taught her to ride her bike one long spring afternoon, her laughter echoing down the block as she wobbled and finally took off on her own. "Look at me, Daddy. I'm flying." "You sure are, baby," I said, running behind her, breathless. Every time I had to leave for another mission, she'd stand by the door, arms folded, trying to be brave. "I'll be back soon," I'd whisper, kissing her forehead. "Promise." She'd nod. But those big, soulful eyes always told me the truth. She didn't believe in promises anymore. One evening, just before I was due to leave for a 4-month mission in Guam, Rosalie and I sat on the couch, the TV flickering in front of us, sound off. Ivy had fallen asleep hours earlier, her favorite stuffed animal tucked under her arm. Rosalie's hand was in mine, but it felt like she was already a world away. "Are you okay, Rosalie?" I asked, turning toward her. She looked at me, offered a smile. But it was tight, practiced. "I'm fine, Griffin. Just tired." "Don't worry." I wanted to press her. Wanted to dig beneath those 2 words, "I'm fine," and uncover what she wasn't saying. But just then my phone buzzed. A call from the base. Final prep for departure. I kissed her cheek, held her in my arms a little longer than usual. "I'll call when I can." She nodded. "Fly safe." And I walked out the door, never suspecting that it was the last time I'd leave with the belief that my family was still whole. Guam was a blur. Night flights, mission planning, tactical pressure, heat and fatigue. A kind of mental wear that made every hour feel twice as long. I called when I could, but Rosalie was hard to reach. She's busy, I told myself. With Ivy. With life. But the unease gnawed at me. One evening, during a rare stable video call, Ivy appeared on screen in her pajamas, hair damp from a bath, smile wide. "Daddy," she squealed. "Look, I lost my tooth." I grinned. "That's a big one. Did the tooth fairy visit?" "She left $5, she said proudly. "And a note." Then her tone shifted, more casual, like she was just chatting about her day. "Uncle Corbin came over today. He brought his paints." I blinked. "Corbin? Oh, that's nice. Yeah, he comes a lot when you're not home." I smiled back at Ivy, but inside, something tightened. Corbin, why was he visiting so often? I'd asked myself that question more times than I cared to admit. But each time I shoved it down with logic, with trust. He was my brother. Rosalie was my wife. They were just helping each other, looking after Ivy while I was deployed. Still, the question had begun to echo louder than I could silence it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to walk into. When my plane touched down in Arizona, I was running on fumes for months of bone-deep fatigue from back-to-back missions. But I was alive. I was coming home. I hadn't told Rosalie. I wanted it to be a surprise. I imagined the scene over and over. Ye's squeal as she ran into my arms. Rosalie's smile as she opened the door and pulled me into her warmth. I wanted to apologize. To fix things. I had a small wooden doll carved by hand from a market in Guam for Ivy, and a delicate silver necklace for Rosalie, etched with the coordinates of where we first met. The truck rattled up the road into our neighborhood as the sun dipped behind the mountains, setting the sky ablaze in oranges and blood reds. I clutched my duffel tightly, my heart pounding with anticipation. Home. Finally home. But when the truck stopped in front of the house, something didn't feel right. There was no soft glow from the windows. No shadows moving across the curtains. The porch light was off. It was too quiet. Still, I shook off the unease and stepped out. Maybe they were at the park. Maybe Ivy had fallen asleep early. I reminded myself not to overthink, not to feed old ghosts. I slid the key into the lock and opened the door slowly. "Rosalie," I called out, voice a little too loud in the silence. Nothing. I stepped inside. The familiar creak of the wooden floor greeted me. Everything looked the same. The worn sofa, Corbin's painting still hanging on the wall, Ivy's toys scattered like breadcrumbs across the living room floor. But the air felt different. Not warm. Not lived in. There was a smell, a heavy, unfamiliar perfume clinging faintly to the air. Not Rosalie's. My pulse quickened. Still, I tried to stay rational. Maybe she had a friend over. I whispered to myself. Maybe they just left. I took a cautious step forward. Then, from the hallway, I heard soft footsteps. And there she was, my Ivy, in those airplane pajamas I'd sent her last year. Her green eyes lit up when she saw me, and she rushed forward. "Daddy," she squealed, barreling into me, her little arms wrapping tight around my legs. I dropped to my knees and hugged her, breathing her in. All the fear, the exhaustion, the doubts, they melted in that moment. "I missed you, Daddy," she chirped, her breath warm against my neck. "I missed you more, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her hair. But then she pulled back, looked up at me, and her smile faltered. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, suddenly filled with worry. "Daddy, hide under the bed," she said, her voice hushed and urgent. "Mommy's coming back soon." I blinked. "What?" I let out a small laugh, ruffling her hair. Why would I hide from Mommy? But Ivy didn't laugh. She gripped my hand tightly, her tiny fingers trembling. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "Mommy, she doesn't want you here right now." The words landed like a gut punch. My smile faded. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" She didn't answer, just looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. And in that look, in that moment, a fear I'd never known before began to bloom inside me. Dark, sharp, and unshakable. I felt an unnamed fear. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the storm inside me. I'll do it." I didn't know why I agreed. Maybe it was the way Ivy's little hand clutched mine, how her eyes, so wide, so honest, pleaded with me without saying the words. Whatever it was, I found myself lowering to the floor, crawling under the bed in the master bedroom, my body folding into the cramped space like I was back in survival training, hiding from an unseen threat. The smell of dust, old wood, and something bitter clung to the air. I could hear the faint ticking of Rosalie's nightstand clock above me, the slow pulse of a life I no longer recognized. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding so loud I was sure the floorboards could feel it. Then I heard it. The front door creaked open. High heels clicked across the wooden floor. "Rosalie." And then a man's voice. Low, Familiar. My blood went cold. No, but I knew that voice. I didn't even need to hear a full sentence. The tone, the casual cadence, it was Corbin. My brother. They came into the bedroom. I held my breath. You sure Ivy's asleep? Corbin asked, his voice low but audible, a tinge of nervousness in it. Yeah, she's out, Rosalie replied. Her voice wasn't tired. It wasn't sad. It was light. Flirty. I heard the door close with a solid click. I lay frozen beneath them. I missed you, Rosalie, Corbin said. Then came the sound, fabric shifting, skin brushing. An embrace. Rosalie laughed. You always know how to make me laugh, Corbin. My world collapsed in silence. The rage was instant, pure, and consuming. I wanted to crawl out, to tear that door open, to grab Corbin by the throat, and demand to know how the hell he could do this to me. To us. I thought about the axe. The one behind the shed. My fists clenched. But then, a movement. I looked toward the doorway. Ivy. She stood there in her pajamas, clutching the doll I gave her, her small face pale and confused, her eyes flicking between the hallway and me. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I couldn't do it. Not in front of her. I couldn't let her see her father break. Slowly, I crawled out from under the bed, each movement feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I stood, looked at her, and whispered, Come on, sweetheart. Let's go outside. She nodded. Didn't ask why. Just slipped her hand into mine. We walked past the living room, past the memories, and stepped out into the night air. Corbin's green Mustang sat parked out front like a signature on a betrayal. That's when everything clicked. This wasn't new. This wasn't an accident. This had been happening. The brother I trusted. The wife I'd loved. And I'd been gone, up in the sky, chasing missions while they destroyed everything I built on the ground. I flagged down a cab, held Ivy close to me in the back seat. She looked up at me, her voice so small it almost didn't reach me. Is Mommy mad at me, Daddy? Pain lanced through me, deeper than anything I'd felt at 30,000 feet. No, sweetheart, I said, doing my best to sound calm. Mommy's not mad at you. She's just confused. We'll figure it out. Okay. She nodded slowly, but the way her fingers twisted in her lap told me she didn't believe me. Neither did I. The cab rumbled down the highway toward Georgetown. My old home. My father's fortress. But even that felt safer than the house we'd just left. I turned toward her, trying to keep my voice light. Ivy, does Uncle Corbin come to our house a lot? She nodded, eyes still staring out the window. Yeah, for a long time, Ivy said, her voice soft and trembling. Like 2 years. My stomach twisted. 2 years. She kept her eyes on the window, her breath fogging the glass slightly as the cab rolled through the night. Mommy told me to stay in my room and close the door when he came, she said. Ivy hesitated, her voice even smaller now. She said if I told you, she'd kick me out. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to register them. Kick her out? My 8-year-old daughter. My grip tightened on the edge of the seat. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. Rage and guilt battled in my chest like a firestorm. 2 years. They'd hidden this from me. Lied to me. In my own home. And worst of all, they'd made Ivy live in fear. They'd used her silence as a shield for their betrayal. I took a breath, shaky and slow, and reached for her small hand. You did nothing wrong, Ivy, I said, my voice cracking despite everything I tried to hold back. I'm proud of you for being brave and telling me. I'll protect you. She nodded, just once. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and I wanted nothing more than to pull her into my arms and promise her everything would be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever. When we pulled up to the Georgetown mansion, the place looked the same as it always had, grand, cold, and imposing. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes were wide with worry, her robe clutched around her. Griffin, what's going on? She asked, looking from me to Ivy. Why did you bring her here in the middle of the night? I didn't hold back. I told her everything. Every detail carved itself into my throat as I spoke, each word sharp and painful. She listened in silence, her hand over her mouth. When I finished, she pulled Ivy into a hug, whispering something into her ear I couldn't hear, then led her gently up the stairs to my old room. When she came back down, tears streamed down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Griffin, she whispered, placing her hand on mine. I didn't know it had gone this far. Then he appeared, my father. Always in control. Always pristine. Even now, well past midnight, he wore a tailored suit like he'd just stepped off the Senate floor. He walked into the living room, glanced at the clock, then at me. What's going on? He asked, voice clipped and formal. I looked him dead in the eye. Corbin and Rosalie, I said. They've been doing this behind my back. For 2 years, Dad. In my house. His expression didn't change. No anger. No shock. Just that usual cold steel behind his eyes. Are you sure, Griffin? He asked, tone flat. Do you have proof? Proof, I echoed, my voice rising with disbelief. I heard them. I saw them. Ivy told me everything. She's been terrified for years because Rosalie threatened her. Still nothing. No reaction. No horror. He just walked over, sat in his favorite leather armchair, and began tapping his fingers on the armrest like he was calculating numbers, not absorbing a betrayal. You're an Air Force officer, he said finally. You know what order and honor mean. If you make this public, you don't just drag Corbin down. You drag me down. The entire Wallace name. I stared at him. What are you saying? My voice trembled with disbelief. Your son's been betrayed. Your granddaughter's been threatened. And all you care about is your reputation? He didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and looked out into the darkness, hands clasped behind his back. Handle it quietly, he said at last. Divorce discreetly. No press. No legal action. Don't let the military know. Understand. I laughed, cold and bitter. I understand, Dad. I finally understand. You never gave a damn about me. Only the Wallace name. I turned and walked out. Left him standing alone in that mansion he called a legacy. I didn't look back. Back in Arizona, just hours later, I stood in front of my own home. Ivy was safe with my mother. But I had to return. I had to face them. I stepped inside, and the silence hit me like a wave. Rosalie was on the sofa. She stood as I entered, her eyes red, face pale. Griffin, she said, her voice trembling. When did you get back? Why didn't you call? I didn't respond. Just stared at her. This woman I'd once believed in more than anything. Corbin, I said, my voice low, cold. How long has he been here, Rosalie? She opened her mouth, tried to speak, then fell silent, looking down. Griffin, I'm sorry, she whispered. Her voice cracked as she looked up at me from where she stood, frozen by guilt. It's not what you think. I was lonely. You were always gone. And Corbin, he was here. He listened to me. Each word landed like a blade, slicing into what was left of my heart. But I didn't flinch. I didn't let her see the pain. I couldn't. And Ivy? I asked, my voice cold, controlled. You threatened her, Rosalie. You told her you'd kick her out if she told me. You think that's okay? She broke. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor in front of me, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't mean to, Griffin, she cried, clutching her arms around herself. I was scared she'd tell you. Scared you'd find out. I love you. I swear I love you. I stepped back. You don't love me, I said flatly. You love the man who's here when I'm gone. That's not love, Rosalie. That's convenience. She sobbed harder, but I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked away. The woman I once built a life with. I didn't recognize her anymore. I found Corbin the next day. A downtown cafe we used to go to as kids when visiting Georgetown. He sat in the corner, slouched in a wrinkled shirt, looking older than he should. He saw me enter, but didn't stand. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Griffin, he muttered, barely audible. What do you want? I sat across from him and placed my wedding ring on the table between us. The silence was heavier than the chair I sat in. If you want her, Corbin, I said, voice hard as steel, take responsibility. But don't ever come near Ivy again. He looked up, eyes wide. I didn't let him speak. I pushed a folded note across the table, a custody arrangement, my terms, and my full withdrawal from Rosalie's life. If you want to keep her, do it with your own hands and your own means. Not mine. Not at Ivy's expense. Corbin looked at the ring, then at me. His eyes were glassy. I'm sorry, Griffin, he said, voice shaking. I stood up. You don't get to say that anymore. And I walked out, the bell over the cafe door ringing behind me. Back at the base, I submitted a report to the mental health officer, detailing everything honestly, but quietly. No spectacle. No scandal. I requested a transfer out of flight duty. I wasn't afraid of flying. But I refused to fly if it meant leaving Ivy behind again. The divorce was processed quietly. I gave Rosalie the house in Arizona. I didn't care for property or pride. All I wanted was custody of Ivy, and I got it. No courts, no press. Just signed papers and silence. My father never said a word. I didn't do it for him. I did it for my daughter. We moved to Colorado Springs on a bright autumn morning. The kind where the sky glows gold and red leaves drift down like feathers from a broken past. I chose a small wooden house near the edge of town, nestled beneath the watchful gaze of the Rockies. It wasn't large. It didn't have elegance or pedigree, but it was quiet, safe, and it was ours. There were no portraits on the walls, no reminders of the Wallace name, just an old fireplace, a window that opened to pine trees and mountaintops, and a single photograph of Ivy and me, smiling. Each morning, I woke up feeling like I'd left something behind in Arizona. Maybe I had. A piece of myself I didn't want back. I wasn't a fighter pilot anymore. I wasn't the man guiding a strike eagle through foreign skies. I requested a transfer to the United States Air Force Academy. Not as a student, not as a pilot, but as a simulator instructor. Right back where my dream had first taken root. Giving up the sky was the hardest decision I'd ever made. Some mornings, I'd still wake up with the phantom feeling of a flight suit clinging to my skin, the taste of adrenaline in my mouth, and the echo of afterburners roaring in my ears. But then I'd hear the soft padding of Ivy's feet down the hallway, and everything would settle. I had made the right choice. She needed me more than the sky ever did. She was only 8, but she saw more than I wanted her to. There was a quiet in her, the kind that comes from carrying too much too young. One evening, over a dinner of slightly overcooked pasta, she looked up at me, her fork swirling in sauce. "Daddy, will Mommy come visit me?" she asked. The question pierced me. I set my fork down and folded my hands, careful with my words. "Mommy, she's somewhere else right now, sweetheart," I said gently. "But I'm here, and I'll always be here for you." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving her plate. The way she poked her food, I knew she was trying not to cry. I stood up, walked around the table, and knelt beside her. I wrapped my arms around her small frame and whispered into her hair, "I love you, Ivy. More than the sky." She smiled, just barely, and hugged me back. That smile, fragile as it was, gave me strength I didn't know I still had. In that moment, I realized I could face anything, as long as I had her. I started building a new rhythm for us. A new life that didn't revolve around airfields or deployments. I taught Ivy how to fold paper airplanes, starting with the basics, like my grandfather taught me. We tied shoelaces, messed up recipes, planted daisies in the front yard. She picked them because they were happy flowers. I managed to spill more soil than I planted, and I always overwatered. "Daddy," she giggled one morning as I knocked over yet another pot. "You're a pilot, but you can't grow plants?" I pretended to frown, scooping her into my arms. "Don't sass your old man," I warned playfully, spinning her in circles until we both fell on the grass, dizzy and laughing. Her laughter mixed with the mountain breeze like music, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the broken pieces inside me start to settle. Evenings became our ritual. We'd sit on the porch with mugs of cocoa or a plate of cookies, watching the sun dip behind the Rockies. She'd curl up next to me, wrapped in a blanket, asking for stories. Her favorite were the ones about my grandfather, how he was shot down in World War II, how he survived behind enemy lines. "Daddy, were you ever scared when you flew?" she asked one night, her eyes glinting under the stars. I paused, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," I admitted. "I was scared a lot. But I learned something. Fear isn't bad. What matters is what you do with it. You face it, and you fly anyway. You do it for the people you love." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than she should. And I looked at her, praying that she'd grow up braver than I was at her age. Softer too, but not weak. My work at USAFA grounded me in a different way. I wasn't in a cockpit anymore, but I still wore the uniform, still taught young cadets who burned with the same passion I once had. I showed them how to master flight in simulators, how to hold their breath through high G turns, how to keep a cool head when everything spiraled. I didn't tell them about the medals. I didn't talk about missions I flew over foreign skies. They didn't need heroics, they needed truth. Instead, I spoke about patience, about believing in yourself, about finding your own path, even when life knocks you down. The cadets looked at me with curiosity in their eyes. I could feel it in the way their conversations paused when I walked into the room, or the way they tried not to stare too long when I stood by the simulator, arms folded behind my back. Major Wallace flew F-15s. I overheard one cadet whisper to another in the hallway one day, "Why is he just teaching simulators now?" They didn't say it with malice, just confusion. I didn't blame them. They were young, eager, still drunk on the dream of flight and glory. I used to be like that, but I never answered the question. I didn't know them that explanation. I wasn't here to justify my choices, I was here to teach. Then one afternoon after class, a cadet stayed behind. Roman, blonde hair, nervous hands, but a genuine spark in his eyes. He walked up to me with hesitation, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Sir," he said, voice a little shaky, "I just wanted to say, I admire you. Not because you flew, but because you chose to stay. For your family. That's the strongest thing." I took the letter slowly, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, cadet," I said, unsure what else to offer in that moment. He nodded and walked away, leaving me standing there, the paper growing warm in my hand. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after putting Ivy to bed. I opened Roman's letter and read his messy but honest handwriting. He'd heard the rumors about the divorce, about my sudden transfer, about the silence I wrapped myself in like a second skin. But what he wrote next made my chest tighten. "You teach us not just how to fly, but how to live." I stared at the words, my throat closing up. I hadn't realized what my silence looked like to others. I'd always seen it as weakness, a kind of retreat from the man I used to be. But somehow, to Roman and maybe others, it looked like strength. After that, a few more letters started showing up. Quiet thank yous, scribbled notes on training manuals. Some cadets even started calling me the quiet teacher. They didn't know my story, but they felt something in how I carried myself. And that was enough to keep me going. On weekends, Ivy loved visiting me at USAFA. She'd run wild across the parade grounds, laughing and yelling while cadets tried not to trip over her. Sometimes she'd sit in on my briefings, coloring in the corner with crayons while I explained G-force tolerance or flight protocols. One Saturday, I took her into the simulator room. It was empty, the lights dimmed, the humming screens waiting for life. I helped her climb into the pilot seat, adjusting the harness to her size. "Daddy, is this like the real thing?" she asked, her eyes wide as the wraparound screen lit up with a brilliant sky. I smiled, fastening a tiny flight helmet over her head. "Close, sweetheart," I said, "but the real thing's up in the sky." She grinned, wrapping her fingers around the stick. "I'm flying now," she shouted, jerking the controls as the simulator tilted gently. I stood there, arms crossed, watching her giggle and pretend. And something warm settled deep in my chest. In that moment, I wasn't a pilot. I wasn't Senator Wallace's son. I wasn't anything but Ivy's dad. And that was what mattered most. At home, I started teaching her small things. Not because I wanted her to grow up fast, but because I wanted her to grow up strong. We made scrambled eggs that came out half-burned, fixed squeaky hinges, learned how to tighten loose screws. One evening, we sat on the porch again, watching the stars slowly appear behind the mountains. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, "will I be a pilot like you?" I smiled, brushing a wisp of hair from her forehead. "You can be anything you want, Ivy," I said softly. "But whatever you choose, I just want you to be happy." Rosalie and Corbin were names I tried not to think about, but they lingered like shadows in my mind. I could go days without hearing them in my head, but then something small, a scent, a place, a look in Ivy's eyes, would bring them back. And I'd remember, not the betrayal itself, but the silence that followed. Rosalie called a few times over those first few months. I never answered. She left long voicemails, each one more emotional than the last. "Griffin, I was wrong. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, please talk to me," she said in one, her voice breaking somewhere between the words. But I didn't call her back. Not because I hated her. God, I didn't even know if I had the strength to hate anymore. But because I had nothing left to say. Every time I heard her voice, all I could picture was Ivy standing in that doorway, her small hands trembling, her voice soft and afraid. "Please, Daddy. Mommy doesn't want you here right now." That image, it burned deeper than anything Rosalie had done. I couldn't forgive that. Corbin never called. Not once. And I didn't want him to. My mother told me he'd moved to New York, throwing himself into his art, chasing gallery openings and critics' praise like it would wash him clean. Rosalie had gone with him. Whether they were still together, I didn't ask. I didn't need the answer. I'd left my wedding ring with Corbin not out of sentiment, but finality. That small band of gold was never coming back. Just like the life I left in Arizona. My father called once, months after I'd settled in Colorado Springs. "You handled it well, Griffin," he said, his voice as cold as the marble floors in the Georgetown mansion. Keeping quiet was the right move. I didn't say a word. I simply ended the call. I didn't need his approval. Not now, not ever. I hadn't done it for him, or for the family name he protected like a brand. I'd done it for Ivy, for the little girl who had already seen more than she ever should have. As time passed, peace came in quiet ways. I no longer dreamed of flight or felt a pang in my chest when I heard the roar of engines overhead. I stopped checking the skies like they owed me something. Instead, I found joy in the things I once overlooked. Ivy's laughter, our afternoon bike rides, the short, honest letters from cadets who saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. I started a journal, not to dwell on what was lost, but to remember what I still had, what I was building. Today, Ivy burned the cookies. I wrote one night, but she laughed so hard the house shook. And for the first time in a long while, I laughed too. That laugh didn't come from duty or distraction. It came from healing. One morning, Ivy ran into the kitchen, barefoot and beaming, holding a crumpled piece of paper like it was a treasure. "Daddy," she shouted, thrusting it toward me. "Look." It was a drawing, crude and colorful, a plane soaring above snow-capped mountains, and two tiny stick figures holding hands below. "That's you and me, Daddy," she said proudly. I looked at it, the corners of my vision blurring. I knelt, pulling her into a hug and holding on tightly. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. I kissed the top of her head and let her go, framing the picture later that day. In that moment, I knew. I'd found something new, something I hadn't realized I was looking for. Not in the sky, but here. With Ivy, I don't know what the future holds. Some nights, I still lie awake, thinking of what I've lost, how easily life can twist and change. But then I hear Ivy's steady breathing down the hall. I remind myself that I'm not flying anymore, not because I crashed, but because I chose to land. For her. For myself. This little house in Colorado Springs isn't the end. It's the beginning. A place where I'm learning to live again. To be a father, a teacher, and a man no longer bound by the past. Time here passes like the gentle breezes through the Rocky Mountains, carrying a quiet peace I never thought I'd find again. Ivy grows a little more each day, from a shy 8-year-old into a radiant, curious 10-year-old who fills the house with laughter and questions about everything under the sun. She still folds paper airplanes, still asks me to tell stories about my grandfather's flights. She still races down the USFA campus halls like she owns the place, her giggles echoing off the walls. But most of all, Ivy is the reason I wake up each morning. The flame that warms my heart on the coldest days. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. More than enough. Our little house was filled with the fingerprints of our quiet joy. Ivy's drawings, rockets, airplanes, flowers, and the occasional wobbly superhero, taped to the hallway walls like a private gallery. Blooming daisies filled the front yard, stubborn and bright against the mountain soil, planted by her tiny hands and guarded like treasure. A small, overflowing bookshelf sat in the corner of the living room, crammed with dog-eared adventure books we read every night before bed, some twice, others 10 times over. I was no longer a fighter pilot, no longer Senator Wallace's son, no longer Rosalie's husband. I was just Griffin, Ivy's dad, and that was the only title I'd ever really wanted. One Saturday morning, Ivy's school held a family day. She rushed into the kitchen with a flyer clutched in her hand like it was a golden ticket. "Daddy, you have to go," she said, tugging on my hand. Her bright green eyes sparkled with excitement. I smiled, pretending to groan as I finished my coffee. "You sure I won't embarrass you?" I teased. She giggled, shaking her head. "Nope, you have to come. Everyone else is bringing someone." That was all it took. I let her drag me out of the house, even though events like these weren't exactly my favorite. Crowds still made me uneasy. I'd spent too long in silence, too much time learning to be invisible, especially after the divorce. But for Ivy, I'd walk through fire. The school was a low building in central Colorado Springs, cheerful with a colorful playground out front and welcome banners flapping in the mountain breeze. Families gathered on the lawn, kids shrieking with laughter, and the smell of fresh muffins and coffee wafted from folding tables. Ivy didn't let go of my hand once. She pulled me from one booth to the next, introducing me to every friend, every teacher, every tree she'd ever climbed. Her voice chirped like a little bird, full of pride. "This is my dad," she said again and again, lifting her chin like I was some sort of superhero in jeans and a flannel shirt. My chest tightened every time she said it. At one booth, a young teacher named Miss Morgan stood behind a table with a colorful poster and a microphone. "We're asking students to come up and tell us about their families," she said cheerfully. "Who they are, what they do, and what makes them special." Ivy's hand shot up before I could say a word. I froze. "Oh boy," I muttered under my breath, walking over to a back row of chairs and sitting down, trying not to look too nervous. Miss Morgan smiled. "Ivy, go ahead, sweetheart. You wrote something, right?" Ivy nodded and walked to the front, holding a small folded piece of paper. Her brown hair was tied high in a ponytail, swaying in the breeze, and her shoes scuffed against the wooden platform as she stepped up. She glanced at the crowd, then right at me. Her voice, when it came, was clear and sure. "My dad teaches people how to fly," she said, holding her paper. "But really, he used to fly really far, like up in the sky in big planes. Then he came back, not because he crashed, but because he wanted to live with me." She turned to me, her smile as bright as the sun. For a moment, everything around me, the noise, the bustle, the crowd, faded away. The entire schoolyard seemed to fall still. I sat there, heart thudding, and felt time freeze. Her words, so simple, so pure, pierced through me like an arrow. I didn't cry, not then, but my eyes stung, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she understood. She saw me. She saw everything. She knew why I gave it all up. Because of her. I slipped away, needing air, needing space, stepping outside to the edge of the playground, past the noise. I stood there, breathing deeply, trying to steady myself. Then I felt a hand clap my shoulder. I turned to find Roman, one of my former cadets, now assisting at the academy. His voice was thick and his eyes glassy. "Major," he said, "that girl's something special." I nodded, unable to speak. "She gets it," he added quietly. "And you did the right thing." Before I could answer, Ivy came sprinting across the lawn, her arms wide, her face lit up. "Was I good, Daddy?" she asked, panting and grinning. I knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "The best in the world, sweetheart," I whispered. That night, after tucking her into bed with her favorite book still in her hands, I sat alone on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky. The night air was cold, but I didn't mind. It wrapped around me like a quiet friend, still and honest. I sat there on the porch, alone beneath the dark velvet sky, and let the silence settle in my bones. I thought about my journey, how far I'd come. From the boy who lived in the shadow of a powerful father, to the fighter pilot who once chased glory above the clouds, to the man brought to his knees by betrayal. I thought of Rosalie, her laughter, her lies. Of Corbin, the brother who knew better. Of my father, who valued the Wallace name more than his own son. And for the first time, I felt no pain. They were part of the story that shaped me, yes, but they didn't define me anymore. Not now. Not ever. I opened my journal, the leather worn from nights like these. My pen hovered for a moment, then moved. Ella said I came back to live with her. And she's right. I closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and looked up at the stars. I used to think that was where I belonged, up there. That the sky, the roar of engines, and the adrenaline were my truest home. But I was wrong. True freedom wasn't flying through the clouds. It was sitting right here with Ivy, in this little house, living a simple, full life. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Georgetown. I recognized the handwriting instantly, my mother's, elegant and firm. "Griffin," she wrote, "I'm proud of you. I've watched you from afar and seen the strength you've shown, how you care for Ivy, how you've chosen family above reputation. You've done what your father never could." There was no mention of Rosalie, no mention of Corbin, no mention of the name that used to be everything. And I knew she had spared me, choosing instead to offer what I needed most, quiet understanding. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beside my bed. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. My mother understood me, and that was enough to keep going. I never reached out to Rosalie or Corbin. Didn't feel the need. I heard through whispers that they were in New York now, Corbin with another art exhibit, Rosalie working at a psychology center. I didn't know if they were still together. I didn't care. The last thing I'd left behind was that wedding ring, slid across a cafe table, never to be worn again. That moment was the severing of every tie to the man I used to be. My father never called again. I hadn't expected him to. He remained in his world of power suits and public appearances, where silence was currency and appearances were everything. But I no longer belonged to that world. One day, during a quiet class at the academy, a cadet raised his hand. "Sir," he asked, "do you ever regret not flying anymore?" The question caught me. I turned to the window where a trainer jet was lifting off, cutting a clean path across the blue. I watched it rise, trailing white behind it. And I smiled. "No," I said, steady. "Flying was part of me, but not all of me. I found something more important." The cadet nodded slowly. He didn't press. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. But I knew I'd spoken the truth. I had no regrets. I had flown through war zones, landed on foreign soil, faced storms no one else saw. But the hardest landing wasn't on a tarmac or airstrip. It was here, coming home, to Ivy, coming home to myself. One evening, Ivy ran out onto the porch, laughing, holding a paper airplane she'd just folded. "Daddy, look," she shouted, launching it into the air. The little plane caught the wind, twisted midair, looped once, then drifted gently to the grass. She squealed, racing to pick it up. I watched her with a smile spreading slowly across my face. In that moment, it all clicked. I'd found the true meaning of my life. Not in medals, not in flight hours, but in the way Ivy smiled, in how she gripped my hand, in the quiet, certain knowledge that she loved me not because I flew through fire, but because I stayed. She sat beside me, legs swinging from the edge of the porch, and I helped her fold another plane. Her small fingers pressed along the creases, brow furrowed in concentration. "Daddy," she said, holding it up, "I want this one to fly as high as you did." I laughed gently, brushing her hair back from her eyes. "It will, sweetheart." She leaned against me. "But no matter where it flies," I added softly, "I'll always be here, waiting for you to land." That night, after she drifted off to sleep and the world outside grew still, I sat alone on the porch, my journal beside me, my heart full. I thought of everything I'd lost, and everything I'd gained. I was once a pilot, a senator's son, a husband, a brother. But now, I was just Griffin, Ivy's dad, the man who found peace in silence. Silence isn't weakness. I've learned that. It's strength. It's how I hold on to what matters most, Ivy. I look up at the night sky now, stars blinking overhead like 1,000 tiny reminders of who I used to be. I once flew among them, thinking that was where I belonged. But now I know better. My home is here, with Ivy, in our little house in Colorado Springs. where I've landed, and where I'll stay forever. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.